Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Universal Basic Income, which we've subtitled The Pathway to Inclusion. My name is Jason Blockhouse. I'm an associate professor in social development studies at Waterloo, and for as long as my Wi-Fi holds out, I'll do my best to moderate tonight from my desk here in Guelph. For those of us who are settlers within and beyond the Grand River watershed, it is imperative to recognize that these are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Attawandaron Nation. These territories are governed by a series of treaties, including the Dish with One Spoon, the Guswenta or Two-Row Wampum, and the 1784 Haldeman Treaty. We acknowledge our collective failure to uphold our commitments and the urgent need to build new relationships based on consent, respect, inclusivity, and justice. For anyone here who might be new to Zoom, a few pointers. Please keep your video off and your audio muted. This session is being recorded, so you might wish to change your name as it appears on your screen. You can do this by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen, click your name, and then hit rename. You can, of course, move back and forth from the speaker view to the gallery view as you wish. And if you have any questions for our panelists this evening, please send them to Jody using the chat box. Jody will pass the questions on to me, and I'll pose them during the Q&A session. After the webinar, Jody will send an email with details on how to access the recorded session. And if you would like to opt out of this, if you don't want to receive this information, let Jody know, if you would, please, through the chat box. This webinar tonight has been brought to you by the Canadian Federation of University Women, a nonpartisan, voluntary, self-funded organization working to improve the status of women and to promote human rights, public education, social justice, and peace. The Guelph chapter is one of 100 in Canada, and by the Council of Canadians, a non-profit organization with over 150,000 members and supporters advocating for clean water, fair trade, green energy, public health care, and a vibrant democracy. The Guelph chapter is one of 50 in Canada. And by the Guelph-based Imagining a Different Future group, which formed when we realized the pandemic was not going to go away anytime soon, and that it was likely to radically change how we do things locally, nationally, and internationally. We focus our energies wherever we can to help make a difference. And now let's meet our panelists in order of appearance. First, we have Evelyn Forget, a professor of economics and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. She is often called upon by governments, First Nations, and international organizations to advise on poverty, inequality, health, and social outcomes. Her most recent book is Basic Income for Canadians, from the COVID-19 Emergency to Financial Security for All. Next, we have Chandra Pasma, a policy analyst and researcher based in Ottawa. She specializes in income security and frequently writes about the relationship between basic income and work. Chandra is a member of the Basic Income Canada Network Advisory Council and co-author of Basic Income, Some Policy Options for Canada. Next, we have Kim Pate, who was appointed to the Senate of Canada on November 10th, 2016. First and foremost, the mother of Michael and Madison, she is also a nationally renowned advocate who has spent the last 40 years working in and around the legal and penal systems of Canada with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized, particularly imprisoned youth, men and women. And finally, Jessie Golem, an entrepreneur, professional writer and photographer, pianist, and activist. She has over 10 years of experience working in the not-for-profit world, both in frontline and administrative work, and in operations management and strategy. She was also a participant in Ontario's Basic Income Pilot Project, cancelled by the Ford government. In 2018, Jessie used her skills in photography to produce a photo series called Humans of Basic Income that amplifies the stories of participants in the pilot project. And without further ado then, let's turn it over to Evelyn Forget, our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think I'd like to talk tonight a little bit about how the pandemic has changed the nature of the conversation about basic income in Canada. And before I begin, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about basic income, because people sometimes use that term to mean very different kinds of things. When I talk about basic income, I see basic income as one component of a robust, responsive, and comprehensive economic, health, social, and safety net. It's inclusive of universally accessible housing, childcare, education, physical and mental health strategies. So basic income shouldn't be seen as a replacement for the kinds of public goods and services that are necessary to life in a high-income country. Basic income comes in different flavors. There are different kinds of basic income. But the conversation recently in Canada has focused on a very particular kind of basic income, which is income tested. It's sometimes called a basic income guarantee or a guaranteed livable income. And what that means is that someone with no other source of support would receive the full benefit. But someone who works, for example, and earns a low income would receive a supplement. They'd receive part of the benefit. So basic income acts both as a replacement for provincial income assistance and a supplement for low-waged working people. So why do we need a basic income in Canada? I think one of the strongest arguments for basic income in Canada is that it's possible to eliminate persistent poverty in this country. We can use basic income to replace the conditional, not very effective income assistance programs we have in this country. And even for people whose income right now is high enough that they don't need to rely on a basic income acts as an insurance policy. It's there when we need it. It's there to help us through the transitions in our lives, and it's there to support us should something happen, either to us as individuals or to us as a society, as we've just seen with the COVID pandemic. So if we were to introduce a basic income in Canada, what could we expect to see? What would happen? We've actually experimented with basic income all over the world, in low-income countries, in middle-income countries. In Canada, we attempted to have two basic income experiments, one about 40 years ago in Manitoba, and the very brief Ontario Basic Income Guarantee experiment. And we do know a few things from all of these experiments because there are certain regularities that we see. For example, one of the things that we know with certainty is that if you offer people a basic income, they don't stop working. This is always a fear of many people. But people, in fact, continue to work if they were working before the experiment began. If they were working before they received a basic income, they work afterwards. In fact, in some of the recent experiments that have taken place in the Netherlands and in Finland, people who participated in basic income experiments actually worked more. Their work effort actually increased when they received a basic income instead of relying on the conditional employment insurance system that was previously in place. One of the biggest effects of basic income is its impact on the health of the people who participate. Physical and mental health are both improved consistently. When people receive money through a basic income, they tend to spend it, they tend to invest it in education in one way or another. We know that economic resilience increases. When people receive a basic income, they're able to set aside money to meet unexpected expenses. We know that family violence declines. We know that criminalization starts to fall. So there are many very positive effects of a basic income. And what basic income really does is that it allows people support through the transitions in their lives. So if you think about children, for example, transitioning out of foster care, a basic income is there to support them as they move into adulthood. If you think about people trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration, a basic income is there to let them do that. It's there to help people as if there's a transition in their personal life. If, for example, they lose a partner or a marriage ends, a relationship ends, a basic income is there to support that. It's there to support people as they leave violent relationships, abusive relationships. So basic income is there as an insurance policy. But what happens when a pandemic comes along and it affects a number of people at the same time? Well, one of the things the recent pandemic did was to shine a spotlight on some of the inequities that exist in this community. We noticed that half of Canadians were living paycheck to paycheck before the pandemic struck. So there was nothing set aside to help them through that transition. We know that a third of the workforce is working in precarious kinds of labor in the gig economy or working part-time when they'd rather be working full-time. And what happened was that many Canadians who never expected to need help found themselves turning to our social programs. And for some of them, it was a rather rude awakening because they discovered that despite the fact that they might have paid into employment insurance, they didn't have enough hours to actually collect enough money to meet their basic needs. So COVID-19 showed us, I think, how frayed our social safety net is. As a consequence, the government was forced to put in place a number of emergency support benefits, including the CERB. And one of the things the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit did was to show us that we also have the capacity to deliver something like a basic income. We had the capacity to deliver a responsive benefit, a benefit that could get money into people's accounts very, very quickly. It was a very simple application process and it worked very rapidly. And so we learned not only that we needed an emergency benefit, that we needed something like a basic income, we also learned that we had the capacity to deliver it. The CERB, of course, was not a basic income. There were a number of limitations in the way it was designed, and there were far too many people that were left out of the benefit. But it did give us an opportunity to talk about what a basic income could do for Canada. It gave us the opportunity to think about how we might design something that helps Canadian families as we move forward. Thank you.
Jason, you're muted.
Thanks for that. Just a reminder to everyone that we'll have the questions after all four speakers have spoken. So next up is Chandra Pasma, please.
Thanks, Jason, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in Ottawa. And it's always a pleasure to speak with Evelyn, and this is my first time getting to speak with Kim and Jessie, which is also a pleasure for me. So tonight I'm going to speak about some of the economics and policy considerations of basic income program design, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the urgency of basic income from a progressive or leftist political perspective. So the design of a basic income program is actually more complicated than you might think from the definition of just a money transfer from government to citizens with very few conditions. But at the same time, it's not nearly as impossible as the opponents of basic income would like you to believe. As Evelyn already mentioned, we have existing basic income programs in Canada that we can build on and learn from. So the child benefit for children under 18 and old age security and the guaranteed income supplement are forms of basic income. And they're different models, but it gives us a lot that we can build on and work with in building out a basic income that would cover all Canadians from cradle to grave. We need to look at both the basic income transfer or payment and the funding as two sides of the same coin when you're building a basic income program, because otherwise you could have a great benefit level, but what you give with one hand, you're taking away with the other in terms of how you fund the basic income. So what Basic Income Canada Network did over the past few years was we actually put together a team, and we got one of the best modelers in Canada to build out 3 different policy options for us, or different ways of constructing basic income. And we looked at what all the design considerations that have to go into it and how you would pay for it and what the trade-offs are between the different models. And I really encourage you to take a look at the paper. As Jason mentioned at the beginning, it's called Basic Income, Some Policy Options for Canada. You can just Google that name and it will pop up, or I will put the link in the comments afterwards. And I really encourage you to look at the paper, but the key takeaway from that is that it is possible with the existing infrastructure that we have in Canada to build a basic income program in a progressive way. In our work, we looked only at sources of revenue for the basic income that we could model because we were using a software program from Statistics Canada. So that meant we depended heavily on changes to personal and corporate income tax. So in particular, we took away a lot of regressive tax benefits where wealthy Canadians can reduce their amount of taxes, but low-income Canadians get absolutely no benefit from it. And then we also increased personal and corporate income tax rates. And we did that not necessarily out of a preference for those taxes, as I said, but because we could model it. But there are many possible revenue sources that we couldn't include that could also fund a progressive basic income in Canada. So offshore tax havens, for instance. The Canada Revenue Agency has estimated that there is over $240 billion hidden in offshore accounts. And if we cracked down on tax evasion, we could significantly increase tax revenue in the country. We could implement a wealth tax, especially right now when we see the wealthiest Canadians profiting from the pandemic at a moment when everybody else is living with severe income insecurity. We could end corporate welfare and handouts to wealthy corporations that really don't need the largesse of taxpayers. We could use resource royalties and create a sovereign wealth fund, much like Norway has done, and then use that the way Alaska did with their permanent dividend fund to fund a basic income for everybody. And then, of course, we could shift existing program spending priorities. And what I mean by that is not that we should cut programs that are currently going to vulnerable people. We're not robbing Peter to pay Paul, but that we're looking at other areas and asking what truly is our priority as a country. Is our priority the latest in military technology, or is our priority ensuring that everybody in our country can live in dignity? Within our policy options paper, we did use existing programs where they were meant to provide income security for people. So for instance, we used the income transfer part of social assistance, but we left the rest of the infrastructure of social assistance in place, recognizing that people might still need employment counseling. They will still need disability supports. There's other programs like employment insurance and the Canada Pension Plan that we left in place because although they play a role in income security, they have other goals as well, helping people to manage a period of unemployment where it's not necessarily a question of poverty, but what happens when your income drops off abruptly, or the Canada Pension Plan where you pay a part of your wages throughout your working career so that you can maintain your lifestyle in security once you retire. So it's really a matter of looking at programs through the lens of what is our priority and not a question of taking away everything that has an income security component and saying, we can't afford that anymore. That's now going to be part of our basic income. Now, opponents, and this includes opponents on the left as well as on the right, like to pretend that it's either or, that either we can have social programs or we can have a basic income, but there's no way that we can have both of those things. Even though, as Evelyn says, no serious proposal in Canada has ever called for the elimination of social programs to be replaced with a basic income, or they argue that we would be forced to give up our social programs if we had a basic income out of necessity just because it costs so much. But to me, that's a tragedy that shows how far neoliberalism has captured our imagination, including on the left, that we have adopted this mindset of austerity so deeply that even on the left, we believe we can't possibly afford to look after everyone and live in a society that meets everyone's needs and allows them to live in dignity. Because it's not either or, it's both and. It's yin and yang, left hand and right hand. So we know that investing in social programs like childcare and universal health care and affordable housing, in addition to being important programs that provide security for everyone, also reduce the amount of income that someone needs to acquire the necessities of life. Even I, as a middle-class person, would have to pay way more out of pocket for healthcare than what I do because we have a universal healthcare system. So it's good for everybody when we have these universal programs, and it reduces the amount of income that everybody, low income and middle income, need to acquire the necessities of life. But at the same time, ensuring that everyone has income security reduces the need for some of those universal programs. So for instance, when you have income security and you're able to afford decent food and housing, you're less likely to be sick. You're less likely to be criminalized, and we don't spend money locking people up anymore. So these work hand in hand, and the fact that we have public programs and services does not eliminate the need for people to have income security, both in the short term and the long term. But essentially in the short term, public programs and services, minimum wage laws, living wage campaigns, as important and as necessary as they are, they will never be able to respond as quickly to the urgent needs that people living in poverty or experiencing a life transition or a sudden shock face. We've seen this with the pandemic. No matter which need you look at, whether it's housing, food, or employment, what we've seen is that the quickest and easiest way that governments could respond with support was with income transfers, whether it's the CERB or the wage subsidy that they provided to people who were still employed, and of course, we need to invest in affordable housing so that nobody is out on the street. But when somebody is out on the street, we don't tell them to wait 5 years while we build a block of affordable housing. We find them housing as fast as we can. And we need to do the same with income security. And too often, I find that critiques of basic income from the left end up coming from a place of immense privilege. People don't understand that there are people in Canada who have gone hungry today. They ate no meals today, or maybe they ate one meal today simply because they don't have the money to buy food. There are people who are losing access to their children in Canada today for no other reason than because they are poor. And I think it's unconscionable for us to tell these people that they need to wait because we've decided that some public program or form of regulation is better for them than just giving them the money they need to not be in poverty, to be able to keep their children, to be able to eat meals today. And I think we also need to respect the role that autonomy and freedom of choice play in giving somebody an essential and important sense of dignity and control in their lives. We need to stop infantilizing low-income people, pretending that they can't make good choices, that their choices are the reason why they are living in poverty, or telling them that they should be grateful for whatever charity or public program we give them. And we should never underestimate the power of being able to make your own choice in life for your health and your well-being. You're going to hear more stories like this from Jessie, but one story that has really stayed with me ever since I heard it is the story of one basic income pilot participant in Ontario who was on the Ontario Disability Support Program for over 30 years. And 30 years of disability support never did anything but make her sicker. And a few months on basic income put her into remission because finally she had the sense of control and autonomy in her life that she needed to be well. And I just want to end tonight by saying I think we need to ask what the alternative to basic income is, because we're not arguing about basic income versus some perfect utopia. The alternative is some variation on the status quo, and we've already seen what that looks like. It's a patchwork quilt of social programs that allows people to fall through the cracks constantly, and they're not even cracks anymore. They're giant gaps, big gaping holes, and it's no coincidence that the people most likely to fall through those cracks are women, racialized people or Indigenous people, newcomers, people with physical disabilities or physical or mental health challenges. And for us to double down on targeting is both to accept the moral underpinnings of targeting, which suggests that some people are not deserving of our help, that they deserve poverty and suffering, and to be fine with the fact that some people are excluded. The pandemic has exposed a lot of things that existed before this year that aren't new, that we chose to ignore. And glaring income inequality and income security are one of those things. The pandemic didn't create them. They've always been here. But the pandemic also gives us an opportunity to do things differently and to think about things differently. And I think basic income needs to be part of that solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra. Thank you. Next, we have Senator Kim Pate.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Evelyn and Chandra, for so clearly laying this out already. I also join you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, otherwise known to many people as Ottawa. And I want to thank and appreciate all the organizers, all of you who are involved, who do this work on a daily basis, my co-panelists, as well as the incredible folks who have gone before me here in the Senate, starting with Senator Kroll, who 50 years ago next year headed up the first report from the Senate that called for a basic income, as well as, of course, Art Eggleton and Hugh Siegel, who have done yeoman service in terms of this work. And my colleagues, 50 of us, signed a letter to the Prime Minister earlier this year in the midst of the pandemic, at the early part of the pandemic, urging that we pivot from the CERB to a guaranteed livable income. And you may wonder, you know, or may not, I'll tell you how I came to be interested in this. As you heard from the beginning, from the introductions, I've spent most of my life and my working life, and certainly my waged working life, working with those who are on the margins. I have been paid and have had unwaged work working with people escaping violence, whether it's children, women, those who are in care, particularly young people, but also individuals with disabilities who, whether it was intellectual or physical disabilities, as well as more recently, because of particular family issues with those who are aged, and looking at the inadequacies of their institutionalization. But probably the work I'm most known for before coming here was the work I did with those who were criminalized and institutionalized, particularly in prisons. And so that's actually what brought me to this issue of guaranteed livable income or basic income. And what brought me to it was the realization that we don't seem to question, if at all, how much we spend on criminalizing and imprisoning people. And now, as I say that, I realize that also the pandemic of racism that's been laid bare during this past year, I would say laid bare for some. Many of us have known, unfortunately, far too much about it for far too long, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But the fact that it was laid bare for some people for the first time with the rise of Black Lives Matter and the Indigenous, the criminalization of water protectors and land protectors, and most recently the Mi'kmaq fishers, lobster fishers, really underscores the fact that we have long used the criminal law. I don't call it a justice system, but use the criminal law and the prison systems and the criminalization process to address issues that are fundamentally about inequality. And I was in law school when the charter was implemented in Canada. And I was struck by the fact that I was in law school and we were told we had to wait for the equality provisions. So those of you who are a certain age will remember that the Section 15 equality provisions didn't come in until 3 years after the charter was brought. We had repatriation of the Constitution, in large part because there was a recognition that we didn't have equality, particularly for racialized people, women, and those with disabilities. And so we had that recognition. 3 years, we were supposed to be good to go. Obviously, that's not true. And when I started working with young people, and in particular saw who was being criminalized, I realized it was predominantly young, poor kids who came from poor families, particularly those who ended up in the care of the state, child welfare, and were essentially shunted right into the legal system because, in fact, many of the group homes where they were put as part of the child welfare placement, those beds would also be used to criminalize them. And so behavior that would never be criminalized in most homes, when I was in my most irritating teenage phase and might yell or heaven forbid, swear or even break something, the chances of the police being called and me being criminalized were pretty slim. but in a group home setting or in a child welfare setting, not so slim. And so I started to see that in fact, who was being criminalized as young people was very much dependent on their level and the intersections of their inequality. Well, how did I end up working with adults? Well, those young people aged, and we see the reality. And then I had been doing mostly volunteer work for about 20 years with women, and then was encouraged to focus in particular on criminalized and imprisoned women. And then the situation became even more clear, where we saw women who were escaping violence, whereas the state, whether it was the police, the prosecutors, their own defense counsel, judges, uh, wouldn't necessarily act to ensure they were protected, but the full weight of the law would come down on them after being deputized and told essentially it was their job to protect themselves and their children. When they did that, if they used force, particularly if they used force that harmed someone, usually the perpetrator of violence, usually against them or their children, then the full weight of the law would be brought down upon them, and they'd be criminalized and imprisoned. So there was that component. There was a component of the growing number of Indigenous women in particular. Women are the fastest growing prison population in this country, even though crime rates are going down, even though the rates of imprisonment of men and young people have been going down, the rates of imprisonment of women continue to exponentially increase. And as we're having this discussion, 44% of the women in federal custody are Indigenous. About 10% are Black. Most of them are poor, about more than 80%. The last time we were able to get the information from Stats Canada are in for poverty-related offences. Most of them, 91% of the Indigenous, 87% of the women overall, have experienced violence in their past. And many of them were involved in drug use or were under the influence when they were criminalized. And much of that use of drugs and or alcohol was clearly related to them attempting to anesthetize themselves to those situations of poverty or the past trauma they'd experienced. So all of that paints a very different picture when you think, and many of them had also developed disabling mental health issues. We also see a number, and the research is just starting to come out now, on acquired brain injuries, the number of people in prisons, particularly women and children, who have acquired brain injury because of the abuse they've suffered, because of the inadequacy of the health care they may have experienced, particularly for Indigenous women and children, and men for that matter, for years of having inadequate nutrition, inadequate health care, sometimes not even drinkable water, as we know. And so the other piece that started to happen about now 25 years ago is when we saw the changes across the country to, now social assistance was never adequate, but when we saw the evisceration even further of social assistance schemes, it became very clear that we were creating what and many of us referred to as an infinitely criminalizable group, that being those people across the country who are on social assistance or on disability. And that doesn't mean that they are criminals. Please don't hear me as saying that. But because the amount of money they receive and the limited access to resources they have is so circumscribed that virtually nobody, I would say nobody, but there may be some hypothetical person out there who could manage, but nobody can actually manage and make ends meet on what is provided on assistance. And so if they were followed, if they were criminalized, and many of you will remember about 20 years ago when the then Conservative government implemented a policy of going after individuals, they actually spent somewhere in the neighborhood, we found out during the inquest into Kim Rogers' death, an Indigenous woman who was pregnant, who was criminalized for essentially welfare fraud for overpayment because she was going to school after she'd had surgery and didn't even know that she was eligible for ODSP. So shouldn't have been criminalized in the first place, but was. And when we were involved in the inquest into her death, we found out that the government was spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 per month to go after welfare fraud, which was a pittance of that. And we're still 90% of the people that were being reported to their fraud line or their snitch line weren't even on social assistance. So we've seen this willingness to spend money to go after people but not invest those resources to assist them. And you've already heard from Evelyn and Chandra about how we could save in terms of the healthcare and the criminal legal system. And bear in mind that we are willing to spend upwards of $200,000 per year to $500,000 per year to jail a woman, and anywhere from $100,000 to $220,000 to jail a man, and the range ranges from province for young people. And yet we aren't willing to invest even a quarter of the amount we put for men, or a fifth of the amount, or my math now is, I'll let you folks who are better mathematicians come up with it, but it's a pittance compared to what we're willing to spend to criminalize and imprison people who then, when they do get out, are left with not only the same situation they had when they went to prison, but worse. If they had housing, it's gone. If they had access to their children, particularly women, that's likely gone. 90% of the women who end up in custody, their children end up in the care of the state, versus about 10% of men, because often the mothers are taking care of the children, or girlfriends or partners or grandmothers. And so we need to stop pretending that we are not already expending vast amounts of money to not assist people, and instead insist that those resources be reallocated and reapplied, and not that we stop abandoning people to the least effective, most expensive systems, and that's our criminal legal system. The amount we spend, the billions and billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars we spend every year in this country on the criminal legal system, we could certainly pay for this kind of initiative. And I would argue, and part of the reason I accepted when I was approached about the Senate was I think we need to invest in people, and we could ensure that every person in this country is housed, clothed, fed, and educated for what we're now wasting in all of the ways that Evelyn and Chandra have already pointed out. And as Jessie will tell us, it doesn't take much to change that. I think we need to be doing more than just providing minimal. We need to be providing livable income. So thank you very much. And thank you again to each of you for all the work you do.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Jessie Golem, please.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really happy to be here and really excited. And thank you to Senator Kim, to Chandra, and to Evelyn, that you have some really fantastic presentations, and I'm in deep admiration of the work that you're doing. And I am coming to you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga territory, which is more commonly known as the city of Hamilton. What people have said before, I was on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and just to tell you a bit about my life before basic income, which I'm sure a lot of people in my generation can relate to. I had 4 jobs. I was working 60 to 80 hours a week. Very, very long work weeks, very stressful. All of these jobs were very precarious employment, contract work, the gig economy, with no protections, no benefits, no healthcare, anything like that. And my contracts could be ended at a given notice, and for no reason whatsoever, and I would have 0 protections. And that was my life, and that is the life of several people, many people I know that are in this sort of same circumstance. And so I signed up for the Basic Income Pilot. I remember I was just, on my phone, just on social media, just scrolling, and I saw an article talking about the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and that the qualifying factors was that you had to reside in these 4 cities in Ontario, Hamilton, Brantford, Lindsay, or Thunder Bay, and I reside in Hamilton. So that ticked off one box, and then you had to be making less than $30,000 a year, which I definitely was making a hell of a lot less than $30,000 a year. So that ticked off another box. And I remember talking to my roommate and just thinking like, well, why not? Why don't we sign up for this? So we did. And I signed up in December of 2017. And this was a pilot. It actually was one of the biggest pilot projects for basic income in the entire world. It had about 4,500 people in their control group, or in the group that was receiving a basic income. And then of all the people that that applied, the people, it was like by random selection. So you would either be in that 4,500 who would receive a basic income, or you would be part of a control group. And both groups would be like tested against each other to determine the quality of life. And that's how the pilot was going to work. So I signed up in December of 2017. And then in February of 2018, I found out I had been approved and I was going to get a basic income. And I remember the very, the day I got that letter, I read the letter and I just thought, okay, cool, got a basic income, time to go to work. So then, you know, I was off and, you know, working at my many jobs, super exhausted, very long day. And then at the end of that long day, that looked like every single other long day, I just remember thinking to myself, I'm like, huh, my rent is covered. My rent is covered. Holy shit, my rent is covered. I just started sobbing in my car driving home, thinking about that possibility and thinking that like, no matter what I did at this point, I would be able to pay my rent. I'd be able to cover my basic necessary costs for living. I can keep a roof over my head. I still needed to work. I still needed to pay for food. I needed to pay for the car I was driving. You know, I need to, you know, pay various bills like internet, cell phone, all that, utilities and everything. But I knew that I had that. So I was able to quit those jobs and focus exclusively on what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to be a full-time photographer. And so I just put all my energy into building my photography business, and I was seeing it work. I was seeing that I was getting more clients. I was booking projects. I was doing multiple shoots, and I was actually making more money than before when I was like scraping together these numerous really terrible paying non-protected jobs. I was actually making more money and I had more time when I was building my own business, and basic income was giving me that floor. And I had actually predicted, like I'd written out a business plan and I did financial projections, and I projected that I would have only needed to have been on the basic income pilot for 2 out of the 3 years that the pilot was supposed to run, because at that point I would have been a full-time photographer. I would have been making a ton of money and I wouldn't have needed basic income anymore. But obviously, if that was the outcome of the story, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. And there was, I'm sure everybody in Ontario is aware that there was an election a few years ago and the Liberal government was replaced by a Conservative government in Doug Ford, who had gone on the record multiple times and had stated it, like, and it is on the record, you can just simply Google it and it is there, and he has stated that he wouldn't cancel the basic income pilot, except that's the very first thing he did when he got elected. And I tell you, hell hath no fury like a photographer scorned. I was furious. I was very angry that he had done that. I realized that I would have to put my business on the shelf and I wouldn't be able to have the assurance and the income floor to be able to build it again. And I realized like this would be devastating for so many people, not just me. Like, I was one of the lucky ones, but this would have terrible consequences for so many other people. And so I determined, in my rage and fury, I determined to produce a portrait series and find these other basic income recipients. So I started taking pictures. I found some other basic income recipients, started taking their pictures and just asked them to hold a sign, and on that sign write down in their own words what they used basic income for. It was a very simple project. So my portrait series is just these people holding these signs saying what they were using basic income for. The portrait series went viral right away. It took me by surprise and sort of propelled me into this new and weird and exciting world, and you know, made me this figure in the basic income movement. And I was able to exhibit the portraits at festivals across Canada, universities, churches, events, give lectures and talks all over the country. Last year I was able to exhibit my photos at the Basic Income Congress in New York City, as well as the Basic Income Earth Congress in India. And then this year, like I had plans to go to Australia and expand my portrait series and include basic income recipients from all over the world. But for obvious reasons that didn't happen. But the issue is still very relevant today. And I think like Evelyn said that so well when we were talking about like how COVID has really changed everything, has really shown like the economic cracks in our society and how the most vulnerable get left behind. I imagine you'd want to see those portraits. So I'm just going to turn on share screen for a second, and I'm going to show you just a few of the portraits. Just give me a second here. Okay, so first one, we have Sarah, and Sarah's actually a friend of mine. Like her and I go out for coffee. She's a good friend. And so she says, basic income alleviated my stress when my income wasn't enough each month. I'm precariously employed. I'm a full-time student and a beginning manual therapist in my community. So Sarah is an osteopathic doctor. And so she was going to school when she was on the basic income pilot. And while she was going to school, she was working at a bar. And the bar that she was working at was not a nice bar, super sketchy. Police had to be called regularly for drunk people and stuff. Just not a fun place. But she'd be there like all hours of the night working, wouldn't get home until, 3 or 4 in the morning, and then up early the next day to go to school and study and to be a doctor. And it was just a really stressful existence. So then basic income allowed her to focus exclusively on her studies. And because of that, she's now a full-time osteopath in our community, and she's helping people. This is Dan and Justine and their daughter, Julia. And in this portrait, Justine is very, very pregnant. She's not pregnant anymore. She has a little toddler named Orion. They have a little toddler named Orion. Basic income program helped us move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood and feel financially secure enough to go back to school to get a better job. And I know where they lived before because Dan and Justine are good friends of mine, and they lived in a place where their backyard, they couldn't allow their daughter to play in their backyard because their backyard was an alleyway. And there was regular instances of gang activity and drug deals and violence in their backyard. So they couldn't allow their daughter to play outside. But now they were able to move to a safer neighborhood with a backyard. And now their daughter and now their son can play outside, and they're in a safer place in a better neighborhood. Dan went back to school. He's now running his own business. Basic income. It's because of basic income that they were able to do this. And so those are some happy stories. These are some not so happy stories. This is Tim. Basic income helps me stay healthy with good food. I am ill. Tim had a workplace injury, which put him onto the Ontario Disability Support Program. And he lives in poverty. He cannot work. He's unable to work. And his family does not live anywhere close. He lives in Hamilton, and his family lives in Timmins. So he's alone here. And it was like interesting to see that while on the basic income program, you would see like a physical transformation of people leaving poverty. Like people would, like you would see them wear nicer clothing. They looked cleaner, they looked healthier, they looked happier, they looked less stressed. You could actually see it. And then what was more heartbreaking was in the wake of the cancellation, seeing a descent back into poverty after that. And that's what I saw with Tim. And it's heartbreaking and terrible to see, and something that I worry about. I still worry about to this day. And that brings me to Michael. Michael Hampson on basic income since January 2018. It changed my life, gave me back my dignity and faith in my community. ODSP chained me in poverty, causing high stress and poor nutritional opportunities. Basic income isn't basic, it's many layered and healing for us recipients in our community. Stand with us. And Michael, I took this picture right after the basic income pilot had been canceled. And in this picture, you can see he was wheelchair bound. He was an advocate and activist for people with disabilities, and he would often do like he would go to different like demonstrations and things, and he would do what he called a crawl in, where he would physically leave his wheelchair and crawl up to the podium to make the statement about the barriers that disabled people have in society, and having equal rights for that. And in this picture, he looks clean, he looks healthy, his hair is nice, he's wearing clean, fresh clothing and everything, and he has a smile. And I remember asking him why he was smiling. Like, I was just like, well, why are you smiling? Like, shouldn't you be pissed off? Like, all of us are pissed off. And he just sort of exuded this like quiet hope and optimism that this was going to be okay. We're going to win this fight. We're going to get through this. We're going to succeed. We're going to have a basic income. And I saw that physical transformation with Michael back into poverty. And the last time I saw him, he didn't look as good as he does in this picture. His clothing wasn't clean. His hair was long and scraggly. He didn't look clean. He didn't look healthy. He didn't look happy. He looked stressed. He looked depressed. And I was worried for him and very scared for him. And I was right to be worried and scared for him, because he died in January of this year. So he died before this pandemic happened, but he died nonetheless. And it was losing the basic income pilot and having to go back into poverty after having experienced getting out of poverty. That is why he died. That is exactly why he died. I'm going to stop sharing for now. But yeah, like, you know, taking these portraits, my goal was to take 50 portraits in the city, in all the cities and all the basic income recipients, and I was able to get 70 portraits, and hear all of these stories, and hear stories of people like Sarah, who went back to school, Dan and Justine, who invested in their children, Tim and Michael, who suffered, who fell back into poverty, who died, people like myself who were building businesses. Like, there wasn't a single person who used basic income to sit on their ass and play video games all day. Nobody was doing that. That just isn't what happened. And people, like, I don't see this as, like, you know, taxpayers giving people free money from the government or any of that part of my language bullshit that people will say about that sort of bootstraps myth. I see this as an investment in humanity. And Kim said that as well, Senator Kim, like in her presentation, like talking about the prison system and the justice system and how many people get incarcerated because of poverty. And wouldn't it be so much better if that money went to investing in these people's livelihoods and investing in people being able to pursue their dreams and live the lives that they want to and do the things that they want to. Like, if I would rather pay for my friend Michael to be alive than not. And so, like, that's sort of what inspires me and motivates this fight. And I do believe, like, especially now seeing like how COVID-19 has devastated the world so quickly and effortlessly, how desperately we need a new world order and a new economic revolution that can reflect this new world order so that we as a society can better handle these storms that will come, which they will, they do. History has shown us that. And I believe that, like, I want to be on that side of history. I want to help to build that better world. I want to tell these stories and say that, like, this is more than just numbers and statistics. These are people whose lives are made better and whose lives can be made better if we do this. And I want to do that. And that's the side I want to be on. So that is what motivates my fight. That's why I'm here. And I'm so honored and privileged to be sitting on this panel with such amazing and admirable people. So I just want to thank you all. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you. And I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessie. Thank you for that. We do have some questions in the queue. The first one is from Ron, who asks, considering the fact that EI now covers only 56% of workers and is difficult to access, could EI be replaced by UBI? And that's a question for Chandra.
Thanks, Ron. I think that you're right, EI is totally broken, but my preference would be to fix EI and have a basic income program, recognizing that there are still times when workers of all income levels lose their jobs and need a transition. And, you know, obviously there's a big difference if you're going from $70,000 a year to zero, and you've got house payments and car payments to be made while you're looking for a new job. And then if you are living permanently on a low income. So I think there's a role still to be played in income maintenance. But what we have done is we have systematically dismantled our social safety net, required EI to play that role of income security for everybody, which is a role that it wasn't built to play. And it's clearly not working. People are falling through the cracks. So let's fix EI and let's have a basic income.
Okay, our next question, I'm afraid I don't have a name associated with it. It says, are there any countries that have instituted basic income, either nationally or regionally? And this is open for anyone.
Well,
I thought Evelyn would be jumping in, but I can say something if you'd like. So there's only one country that has a permanent, or one region, I should say, that has a permanent form of basic income, which is Alaska with its permanent dividend, where every resident in the state of Alaska gets a payment annually from the oil revenues in the state. But there are a number of regions around the world where there have been basic income pilots and projects, including Finland, the Netherlands, Spain, India, Kenya, and as Evelyn mentioned, at least 2 in Canada. So we've seen lots of evidence that it works, and that it works in a variety of different political and economic systems.
Okay, we have a question here, I believe it's for Evelyn. Would UBI be regional, provincial, or territorial, since there are vast differences in the cost of living, especially housing, across Canada? This is a question from Richard.
I think there are a number of different ways you could deliver a basic income. My own preference would be to see this as a national program that sets a floor, and then to have other particular focus programs to deal with special regional issues. So if you think, for example, of the very high cost of living in the north and the high cost of food, instead of designing a basic income to deal with the particular cost of living in every particular area, you could have a national floor and then a particular focus program to deal with those issues, or similarly to deal with the cost of housing in Vancouver or in Toronto.
And a follow-up question from Richard, assuming that UBI would be a federal program to provide income directly to Canadians, not through the provinces or territories, would there be any guarantee that jurisdictions would not be able to impose taxes or clawbacks of some kind on the UBI?
Ideally, you would like to see the provinces and the federal government negotiate this together. We haven't had a lot of experience of that working very well, particularly in recent years. I think the provinces would probably claw back provincial income assistance if the federal government were to introduce a basic income. In recent years, whenever they've done anything like that, the provinces tend to treat it as income for the purposes of calculating income assistance, and they reduce income assistance. But since a basic income will be larger than provincial income assistance, recipients would be better off. It is unlikely to be taxed provincially through the income tax system. So I don't think that's something to worry about.
We have a question from Mandy. Many right-wing economists and organizations support basic income. They don't care about people. They don't support the social programs we currently have. So do any of you know why they support UBI? what are the arguments in favor of UBI coming from the right? So I see.
I'm an economist, so let me tackle that one. I can be kind to them or I can be nasty. If I want to be nasty, I think that we have to worry about some people who see UBI as a replacement for large parts of the social safety net. So I think when people tell you they support basic income, you need to find out what kind of a basic income they mean by that and how they see it fitting into the rest of the programs we have. If I want to be kind, I say that, you know, if you are an old-fashioned red Tory, for example, you probably would support a basic income. And I think the reason you'd support it is because it's much less intrusive into the lives of people. It's very consistent with a conservative ideology, a conservative view of the world that really does believe that individuals should be able to make their own decisions.
I think, Chandra, you also would like to weigh in on this, would you?
Sure. I mean, Evelyn had a great answer, but the other thing that I would add is, as we've seen with Jessie's presentation, basic income can actually help get people into the labor force, which we have seen social assistance does not. Social assistance actually ends up creating a wall where the rules are designed in such a way that working can actually result in the loss of more than 100% of your benefits. You know, you can lose all of your income support, you can lose your rent geared to housing, and you can lose disability supports that your family is getting. So we've created a situation where if you're going to go back to work off of social assistance, you need to be going back to work at a level that's much higher than what you're getting on social assistance. And what we see with basic income that even right-wing economists appreciate is instead a gradual transition where no matter what your income level is, you are always better off working. You are always making more money working than what you are if you are just on the guaranteed income. And we've also seen that economic insecurity makes it difficult for people to work. It's actually more detrimental to people's health and well-being than just poverty itself, that instability of income, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing where you're going to live. So just creating that stability and that sense of certainty allows people to take risks, entrepreneurial risks, the risk of going back to school to try a new career. So as Evelyn says, if you are a certain type of conservative, you actually appreciate that it actually helps empower people and gets them into the labor force.
I think Jessie is anxious to weigh in as well.
Yeah, sorry. So just like why the right supports a basic income? Yeah, what I have seen is people on the right, either they support a basic income because, yeah, like what everybody said, it can replace, like it can replace social services. So they're looking at it purely fiscally and saying that it will save money. And historically, it was actually in the 60s and 70s, like it was actually it was very popular in conservative circles. Like Milton Friedman was a huge champion of basic income, and Richard Nixon, a Republican, tried to pass a bill for a basic income in the House in the United States that would have made every American have a basic income, and it was defeated by a Democratic Senate. And funny enough, one of the reasons that it failed was that they were afraid that women would leave their husbands, which I think is really funny. But yeah, and then I think people are always concerned about like the motivation to work. And if you get a basic income, people are just gonna sit at home or play video games all day and nobody's gonna work. But that's not what happens. And we have said this in this presentation already, like I believe it was Chandra who said this, but when people get a basic income, the work actually, like, people either worked the same or they work more. The only people who worked less were stay-at-home parents or people caring for dependents, elderly or disabled friends or family, or people who are going back to school. Those were the only people that worked less. Everybody else worked more. And I like that whole, like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps myth is just that. It is a myth. It's not true. I think that's all I want to say on that, though, because everybody else has said everything else that I would have said. So, yeah.
Okay, very good. We have a question here. What do you think are the key criteria for deciding which approach to basic income should be adopted? And I don't have a particular, it's not indicated who this is targeted to, but perhaps we'll ask Senator Kim Pate.
Well, one of the approaches that I am particularly fond of is the universally accessible, but as has been pointed out by Evelyn and well, by everybody else, it's something that's universally accessible, but not necessarily a demo grant. So, and something that's livable. So I think it's fantastic, the results that the basic income had in Ontario, the pilot, but that was 70% of the poverty line, you know, under the poverty rate. And I think we should actually do better than that. And if the government decided that $2,000 per month was a minimum of what people needed here, then maybe we should start with that. And so I think we can do it. And I apologize, I meant to if anybody's interested in the work we've done, our perspectives document on this, so that you can get more detail about what we're proposing. I'm trying to share it in the chat with Lisa. Lisa, I think, is trying to share it with you, Jason, because I'm a total techno-twit. And we also have a podcast that Evelyn and Jessie have been on, and we've done a number of features around guaranteed livable income. So people are welcome to listen to that as well. So if people are interested in some of that work that's being done and some of the op-eds and pieces, in addition to all the incredible work everybody else has done, then feel free to just reach out and we'd be happy to send it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question. It's a little detailed. I'm intrigued by the idea that these huge sums are being spent to investigate so-called welfare fraud and to incarcerate people. Could BI be a project that works hand in hand with reforming our criminal law system so that a budget could be built based on projected savings as these reforms come through? For example, if opioids were legalized, there would be a projected savings from not incarcerating drug users. Could the money then be allocated to BI? And I see not a lot of nodding on the panel. Who would like to jump in?
Well, I'll quickly say something and then pass it over to the experts. But yes, this is exactly why I became interested in this whole area. I think we do need to decriminalize and decarcerate, and guaranteed livable income provides opportunities both to do that and also to pay for it if we actually invest those resources, like Portugal has done, for instance, in community supports, as opposed to putting people in prison because they have addiction issues or drug use issues, and they don't necessarily have to have addiction issues. And so I think it's a really important piece. The other is the impact of criminal records. One of the bills that we have that I'm sponsoring right now is a bill to allow criminal records to expire, a whole nother issue, and dealing with mandatory minimum penalties. Well, if we decriminalize drugs, we get rid of a number of mandatory minimum penalties as well. So I think there are many ways in which the defund and decriminalize actually and decarcerate all go well together with the guaranteed livable income, basic income arguments.
I would also suggest it's an opportunity to reform a number of other things, including the fact that there's this big infrastructure built up around poverty. You know, the caseworkers, these advocacy centers, social workers who have to exist to help people navigate this complex system that we've set up, who have to then police people because we've made it a very controlling and punitive system. And this is an opportunity to shift those people to other programs that are more beneficial and helpful. So for instance, instead of administering Ontario Works through the Ontario Disability Support Program, they're administering our new Universal Childcare Program or our new Universal Pharmacare Program. And I think for those workers themselves, that's a better, more engaging form of work where you get to feel like you're making a difference in people's lives instead of constantly punishing them and dragging them down. But I would caution that although there's obviously cost savings to be had, we shouldn't look at it as like a one-to-one, especially with the first generation, that the impacts of living in poverty don't just go away the second you are out of poverty, that there are still additional health costs associated with it, that the impact of having been criminalized doesn't go away the moment we adopt a new approach. So we've got to think about it as a transition period where those costs might still be higher. But as we move into the next generation, and we have a generation of people that were raised in income security where we're not punishing and penalizing people, then we see those costs really significantly go down.
Jessie, Evelyn, anything to add? All right, very good. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the hopper. Anyone? Okay then. Very good. Well then, I suppose we'll, if there are no further questions from attendees, then I suppose we'll give our thanks to our panelists for for being with us tonight. A very informative talk. And yes, thank you all. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks for being here.